Okay, so Gunner's doing well, but going through a little pain. Mike and Ralph are recovering. And we want to thank your family for going to the mountains and bringing us rain. Appreciate it. I'm sorry. You just need to go. They have the Ward's vacation for you. When they go camping, we will get rain. It's guaranteed. That's right. It's been 6 weeks without rain. They went camping. We got rain. There you go. All right. So Andy, can you lead us in a word of prayer to get class started?
Did you tell about Mary Allen had a slight heart attack?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Apparently she thought she had heartburn, but it was a slight heart attack.
Okay.
No, she's back from UVA, from Martha Jefferson, back home. And then Jim Herndon was here, but his back was hurt, so he
Went home?
back.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Our dear Lord, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to assemble as your church, for the joy of knowing you, the joy of knowing your Son, and the joy of fellowship with your children here on earth. Please be with us tonight. Help us to learn to love you more and learn to know your ways more and deeper. Please help us to be better examples of what your purpose is for our lives. Please be with our sick. Christ's name.
Thank you. All right. So last week we started off with the concept of who overcame the most in their lives, and we went through several names, and we ended up spending last class on Joseph and the 4 clear incidents in his life that he had to overcome. And one of the names that was brought up when I opened up who overcame and who surprisingly, for lack of a better word, had a comeback. One of the people that was mentioned was James. Well, tonight we're going to study James. And James, I've always had, this is one of those things as a kid, all of our minds works a little bit differently. So I always had an empathy for James because, James is obviously of all the Jesus' brothers and sisters, the one we know the most about. But, how many of you all have older brothers and sisters? Julie, you can raise your hand. Okay, so there's a phenomenon of growing up behind someone, especially if that someone is exemplar. So if you have a brother or sister who goes through high school, junior high, high school, and excels at stuff, all you ever hear from those teachers is, wow, so-and-so was my best student. So-and-so was a pleasure to work with. So-and-so was a great athlete. So-and-so. And it's annoying. There's really no two ways around it. It's annoying. Your brother or sister, whoever went before you, was perfect. And obviously they're bringing this up because you are less than perfect. And the comparison goes on and on. You don't ever really get out from under it. But so James is coming along and he's growing up behind Jesus. Okay? No offense, but luckily for me, my sister wasn't perfect and I could always play off of that. Can you imagine you're James? Why can't you be more like Jesus? Well, James obviously didn't have this in his repertoire. My response with all full knowledge would be, I'm not God. I don't remember creation. He does. So James is kind of going through this transition in his life where he's following Jesus. And that's a fairly large burden. We don't know what the family dynamics were with Joseph and Mary as they talked to their kids about Jesus. Did they describe Jesus as their stepbrother? Who knows? Probably not, would be Jeff's guess. But James is kind of coming along in this path after Jesus, and we know from the writings in the Gospels that when Jesus came to his hometown, what was the reaction of his brothers and sisters to Jesus? He was nuts. I mean, that's what they said. Look, we'll get our brother and we'll move him off to the side here because he's not right. So, it's very obvious that initially in his life, James did not buy into the concept of Jesus as the Messiah. And so, he kind of has that in the background. And, in Paul's writings in Corinthians, we know that Jesus appeared to James after the crucifixion. And, once again, we don't have a lot of knowledge of that, but that event propels James into a role that is very different than we know of James before Jesus' crucifixion. So obviously there was something that occurred in James's life that made him change how he viewed his brother and to become the kind of the pillar of the New Testament church in Jerusalem. And we know that because of the writings in Acts. And, James, the good news about James is we not only have the writings of Paul and Luke in Matthew, and Luke in Acts, and then Paul's writings later on in his letters to the various churches. But we know that James, through secular writing, was extremely well known. Eusebius and Josephus also write about James. And Josephus is the one that referred to James as James with the camel knees. And his reference was how much James spent on his knees praying. That's why the whole camel knee thing was attributed to him in Josephus. And he also called him James the Just, meaning that James had a reputation amongst that era as being an extremely religious, extremely reverent, extremely praying, and an acknowledged leader of the church in Jerusalem. And the church in Jerusalem goes through a fairly significant upheaval while James is there. I mean, the persecution starts, the Christians start to leave Jerusalem. And, so during this period, one of the books that I find, without a doubt, to be the easiest to teach is James's writing in the book of James. It's an amazing book in that in a little over 100 verses, James actually gives you 50 proclamations of what you should do. It's a very, very pointed, very straightforward, very easy to understand book. And James relies upon two sources for a large majority of what he writes. And I'll give you a handout, but I'm going to quiz you all. What are the two things that James relies upon to write his book? Okay, good. So it's new knowledge. I think I got enough. There you go. Okay. Well, I need yours. All right. So that handout kind of, and it's always one of the things that when I studied James, it's really apparent when you read it that James is relying heavily on the Sermon on the Mount and Proverbs. Those are the two things that drive heavily into how James wrote his book. And the good news about this handout, it's one of the better handouts I've ever seen that kind of covers this concept. It goes through and shows you the corollary of what James wrote right back to the Sermon on the Mount. And that's the 3 pages I handed out to you. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but it's great if you ever just want to study the book of James and the corollaries that he writes. But he spends a tremendous amount of time referencing the Sermon on the Mount. And I didn't add up how many there are here, but let's just say there's 15 to 18 references directly from James to the Sermon on the Mount. And the other one that he heavily relies upon is the book of Proverbs. So James, he's not near the learned man that Paul is. His writings cause some consternation amongst the, what I'll call the early Christians. In particular, it caused great consternation with Martin Luther. Martin Luther was not a fan of the book of James when he first read it. In fact, Martin Luther went and created his own Bible that said what the relevant books are and what the people who were following should read. And he put James last with Revelation. Martin Luther referred to it as a book of straw. He just saw nothing relevant there at all. And his big problem with James was that James's theory and James's proclamation throughout his book is, okay, you say you have faith. Tremendous. Show me. James isn't saying you have to earn your salvation. James is very clear in his writing. If you have faith and you believe in God, then there are actions that are required. You're not earning your way to salvation, which was how Martin Luther viewed the book. James isn't saying that, and he's very clear he's not saying that. He's saying you believe in God, and therefore you believe in the gospel. And the truth of the matter is, there are certain actions that are required. There's a way of living and a way of service that's required, and you're taking on this mantle as Christian. And James, I think the best part of what James wrote is, show me your faith by your deeds. And then he knows what people are going to say. Well, I have faith. That's all I need. And James's reply is, Satan and his minions have faith in God. They're not saved. Faith alone gets you nowhere. And if you understand Martin Luther's teaching, that's a problem. That's a problem for Martin Luther. Martin Luther strongly wrote and strongly believed, and he was actually, Martin Luther's process was, Martin Luther was revolting against the Catholics, and they're earning your way to salvation. And there were several things that the Catholics could do to buy redemption, buy forgiveness, and Martin Luther was adamantly opposed to that. You can't earn your way to salvation. And he viewed James's writing, that's what James was saying. You earn salvation. And which is kind of funny because, when you read James, at least when I read James, I never see that. I never, if I hadn't read what Martin Luther's opinion was of James, I would have never walked away with the view that James was saying, you have to earn your way to salvation. So, the way I always correlated it is, Jeff, you're a consultant at KPMG. You accept what that requires. I mean, you can put the name consultant by it, but if you want to be a consultant for long, you better get chargeable. Because that name consultant, and you're not chargeable, you're not a consultant for long. And James is saying the same thing. You want to put on the name of Christian, then get about being a Christian. Let your actions of being a Christian be shown and be clear. And that's what James kind of spends most of his writings on. And I like the way James kind of progresses because it's an easy book to understand. James starts off his teachings with, be joyful with your trials. And to me, even as when I first studied this, I was probably in high school in any meaningful level. I always found James, the way he started out, it's almost like he wants to get your attention. James just punches you in the eye right to start the book out. You're a Christian. Here's a requirement. Be joyful in your trials. That's the first sign that you're a Christian. because it's going to teach you stuff. And in James's view, it teaches you endurance or perseverance, depending on which of the languages you have. And he not only says you have to endure it, he uses this concept of it's pure joy. Now, I probably hadn't gotten to that level. Yeah, all of us have had trials and temptations, some more than others. But the concept that every time you have these trials and tribulations that you should view it as pure joy is still a little elusive to me, but I kind of get what James is saying. And it kind of relates to what we talked about last week, where the key to our salvation is knowing that God has a plan for us. And part of that plan is these tribulations. And James is saying they're put there for a purpose. And it's, like I said, it's really one of the big struggles in life. It hasn't been so much the trials and temptations for me. It's been the trials and temptations of members of my family. Those are a little bit harder for me to reconcile, but once again, you kind of have to accept that God has a plan. Not that I, to this day, understand it, but he's got a plan. And you have a job to go about, and you have to do it, in James's word, with pure joy. Now, when you think of pure joy, what comes to mind? You all have experienced pure joy. Give me an example of just pure, unadulterated joy. See, there you go. If you all didn't know, Marshall roots for Martin Truex. And so when Martin Truex wins the championship, Marshall has pure joy. I mean, Julie, pure joy.
Watching the kids have fun.
Yeah.
Watching kids laugh and play.
Yep. Janet? Yeah.
Can't describe joy, there just aren't words for it. It's just a feeling that wells up and you feel like your cup is overflowing and you can't really describe it to someone else. Each person's joy is different, I think.
Sure. Andy?
I think of that expression on someone as they come out of the baptismal waters for the first time. Sheer euphoria, I guess. That's what I think about.
Yeah, and once again, the scales are different. Everybody kind of goes through it. But I got to admit, since we've been doing the kids up here, watching them recite their prayer, go through their prayers, go through the books, and watching their excitement about being a part of this service, being a part of this congregation, you kind of, once again, I've been in church pretty much my whole life, but there's something different when the kids get up and pray. I mean, no offense to Marshall and Andy and Jim and anybody else who prays, but when Gunnar and Levi and Lila and when they get up and pray, it's just a different feeling. They just are. It's pure. When they pray for all of us to be well, for everybody who's sick, for the people who are at war, just for their prayers are always about the well-being of others. And it's just kind of, it's innocent, and it makes your heart kind of respond differently. Well, I shouldn't say yours. It makes my heart respond differently. And so you put that in the context of you're supposed to have the same reaction that we just talked about when you suffer trials and tribulations. And that's a tough linkage. I mean, so Janet, talked about the birth of her children. Well, the next time she has a trial and tribulation, she's supposed to have that same feeling. It's a tough linkage. I mean, and James hits you with that when he starts the book out. He says, look, this is all part of God's plan. Embrace it. And it's hard. Well, it's hard for me. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's one of those things where you have a plan, he has a plan, And the value you get from overcoming things is extremely satisfying. Okay, and once again, I reference my professional career. And maybe I'm warped, and I'll throw that out. I'll throw that out there immediately. I expected to win, okay? Consulting is competitive. You propose, you fight, you put your best proposition forward. I expected to win. So the wins, they were expected. The things that stayed with me were the losses. And it was like, yeah, especially the losses where I knew we were the best. And it's, your first reaction is, okay, they're just wrong. That's my first reaction. They were just wrong. But then the way we were built at our company, we didn't go back and do reviews of the projects we won. We did detailed analysis of the projects we lost. And I got to admit, in kind of keeping with James, it wasn't pure joy to go through those, because as the lead person, when you lose big contracts, it's not pure joy. But I got to admit, when we went back to the client and did a debrief on why we lost, I learned more from those sessions than I ever learned from the projects we won. And it was amazing the things that they would share with you about why they didn't choose you. And I think James is saying here, you're going to learn to be a better Christian by trusting in God's plan and overcoming whatever trials and temptations, whatever obstacles he puts in front of you. And that's what you should be savoring, is what you learn about you as a Christian, what you learn about your fellow Christians, what you learn from going through that. And it will make you a better person. And I think that's what James is saying here. Understand that as you go through this, you'll be better prepared for salvation. You'll be better prepared to meet Jesus and God. Accept that. And that's the joy he wants you to comprehend. But I've always found it interesting that James starts the book out right there. And then he tells you, okay, now that you get by these trials and temptations, I want you to understand that what we're trying to do on this, and he spends chapter 2 through and chapter 4 spending a tremendous amount of time on this concept. Your role here on this earth is to perfect your faith. And this is the process that you're going to go through. There's no shortcuts. There's no way around it. Here's the prescription for perfecting your faith. And it's like I said, I think James is one of the more practical books ever written. But yeah, and I have, when you look at my book, I have tons of things starred and underlined in James because it's easy to understand. So, verse 19 of chapter 1. And I've mentioned this over and over again to the high school kids, to the point that if they don't get anything else out of having spent the last year with me, hopefully they got this. My dear brothers, take note. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to be angry. And I got to admit, looking back on my life, if Christians would just internalize this, we would be a much more successful, we would be a much more serving, we'd be a much more engaged and productive members of Christ Church if we internalize that. Because, and none of my bosses were strong Christians, but the guy who kind of mentored me, Jack Doyle, he goes, I'm going to use a Christian thing for you, and if you ever just want to learn anything, he said, James had it right. To be a successful consultant, shut up. Ask questions. The client will give you the answer. Just stop talking. And I got to admit, James and Jack were right. If you spend more of your time trying to understand what other people are trying to communicate to you, you're going to be a much more successful husband. You're going to be a much more successful brother and sister. You're going to be a much more, I can't speak to parents because I don't have kids, but I assume you'll be a better parent. But you're a better boss. You're a better employee. You're a better friend. If you spend your time trying to understand what those around you need and what they require to be better Christians, to be better friends, to be better brothers and sisters, better spouses, everything works out better. It all works out better. And James's last point of being slow to anger, I mean, I hope we have unanimity here. Being slow to anger is an extremely positive trait, right? I mean, there's nothing more destructive than being around people who get angry all the time. Because what's your reaction when you're around people who are angry all the time? How many of us want to hang with them? Anybody here go out of their way to find angry people to have dinner with? Andy? Okay. But James, that's what I like about James. It's an easy book to apply. And it was true in the first century, and it's true now. And then he goes on and says in verse 22, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, but do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away immediately and forgets what he looks like. And it's easy to apply. I mean, which is why I always struggle with Martin Luther. James is just saying, look, Christ told you what it was like to be a Christian. The apostles communicated the message, and now we, the leaders of the church, communicated that message to you as well. Christ expects you, if you take on the name of Christian, to behave in a certain way. And that way is not passive. Jesus wasn't passive. Paul wasn't passive. Peter was not passive. James is not passive. There's an action that is required of you. And that's what James is saying. It's like, look, don't deceive yourself. Don't read the book and go, I believe, and think that's enough. And yeah, it's one of the truisms that I found in church and work and life is, you know, the people who complain the least are the people who are busy. I mean, it's a truism. I mean, the people that were constantly leading and driving our business, man, they never complained, but when they did, I paid attention. You know, if Tom McKelvey came to me and go, Jeff, you're making a huge mistake. All righty. Okay. I stopped. And I listened to what he had to say. There are a whole bunch of people that came into my office and said, Jeff, you're making a mistake. And it's like, yeah, good. Lee, why don't you get your numbers up and we'll talk about it. But there are the people that are busy going about what they're asked to do, spend very little time complaining. Their plate is full. They're serving. They're doing. That's what James is saying. Look, you're not here to critique everybody else in life. You're here to do what God's plan asks you to do. That's why you're here. Go about doing what you've been asked to do. Other stuff will take care of itself. Verse 26. Like I said, there are certain verses I've always just captured in James, but this one in particular. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. So it's building upon itself. If you honestly believe you're a Christian and you want other people to be affected by how you're behaving and see Christ through you, be careful. Be careful what you say and how you say it. Because, let's be honest, people can do 90% things that are just in keeping, but that 10% where you tore somebody down, or you were unnecessarily rude, or you were unnecessarily vindictive in how you approach them, it's really hard to go back to them and say, hey, you want to come to church? Hey, I represent Christ. Well, you did 90% of the time, but I still haven't gotten over that other 10% where you left me laying on the side of the road with my innards out, waiting for somebody else to pick me up. I'm trying to reconcile these things. And James is saying, look, just be careful, because the most powerful weapon you have is your tongue. So, anybody disagree? And then if we go over to chapter 2, he kind of deals with the whole concept of favoritism in the church. And clearly that was a big issue as the church was persecuted and went out into the world, because they ran into these people that they were told to disdain. They ran into the Gentiles and the Samaritans. And I think we talk about the concept of racism and the concept of, not treating people justly, and what we currently refer to as the woke. This was not woke. The Jews were taught from the day they became and realized they were a Jew to have nothing to do with Samaritans and Gentiles. They were taught that they were inferior people. Okay? They didn't cloak it. They didn't try and hide it. There was no, let's all be friends coming out of the Jewish faith. Jewish faith wasn't about proselytizing Gentiles and Samaritans. They didn't have that as their mandate. They were told, keep your distance, and they're not really people. So now, Jews are being pushed out of Jerusalem and being told, go evangelize. And evangelize to everyone. And I think we pass over that pretty quickly. And if you kind of grew up in Judaism, and now you're being told to evangelize and socialize with the Gentiles, you kind of get the socialize with them. You don't get the part where they're the same. They're equal. And the famous one is Paul, when he chastises Peter, saying, look, you were great with the Gentiles until the Jews came. Then you stopped socializing with them. Julie?
Just to your point, in verses 8 through 11 there, James uses adultery and murder
Mm-hmm.
and compares them with favoritism. And those were two big sins. Sins that you could be, for which you could be put to death. And he's saying showing favoritism is a sin. It's just as egregious.
Mm-hmm.
Gentiles are people, and you cannot ignore them as anything other than God's children do.
Right. And James paints this, and he's the best writer in the New Testament on this. He paints this concept of reciprocity. So if you go to chapter 2 and verse 12, speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. James is like, look, judgment's really easy in some ways. I want you to understand this. If you're not merciful to the people you are evangelizing and serving, Christ is going to take the same standard to you. Be careful. Because how you judge and how you interact with believers and non-believers is the same standard that Christ is going to use for you. Tread carefully, as my dad used to say when he thought I was being disrespectful. Tread carefully. It's like, got it. You want me to stop. Didn't always mean I stopped, but at least he'd give me a fair warning. And that's James is here. He's like, be careful. Think about what you're doing. Because that same standard you're using, I'm going to use with you. And I got to admit, I've always enjoyed studying James because he's clear, and it's relevant, and it's easy to apply. And he writes it in such a plain way that you can't read it and not at least do some self-evaluation. I mean, there is no great philosophy here. There's no great, he wasn't taught the same way Paul was taught. He doesn't get into the mysteries of the creation. He doesn't get into the mysteries of the Levites and the scribes and the Pharisees. That wasn't his background. He just writes to you what my grandfather used to say is the plain truth and nothing but the truth. It's easy. Not easy to apply, but it's extremely easy to understand. And then he gets into the whole concept of faith and deeds that we talked about. And we'll skip over to chapter 2, verse 18. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without your deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. You believe there is one God? Good. The demons believe that as well. So it's not hard to understand what James is saying. If you think your faith alone is going to get you salvation, you're not understanding Christ's message the same way I am. One requires action. The other, where you just say, I believe in God and I believe in Christ as the Messiah, and then you sit around in a cave and don't interact and don't do what you're asked to do. James is saying, that's not how it works. So James can kind of, and the other thing about James that I like is, if you missed it the first time, good news. I'm going to repeat it. So if you go on, you see in chapter 3, verse 7, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. So if you didn't catch it when I said it before, understand that little thing you call your tongue is the most lethal weapon that God gave you. It can proclaim Christ and salvation, or it can just decimate the people that you're supposed to be serving. And James is good about that. I mean, I like the way he kind of keeps coming back to his key points. It's almost as if he's had children. I know you're not going to catch it the first time, so the fifth time I cover it, hopefully you'll understand this is important. This is something you need to pay attention to. This is kind of what we always call a bedrock principle. This is what your life has to be built around. And I think more than anything, the one thing that, when you read the book of James, you can't walk away without understanding that your actions have consequences. You are responsible for you. Your salvation isn't dependent on your mom and dad, your brothers and sisters. They can't get you there. It's you. You don't live their faith. They can't save you. You. You have to control your tongue. You have to serve. You have to do what is expected of you. God has a plan for you. And James says, embrace it. Understand, there's a code that goes with being a Christian. Live it. So that was I have more, but we're coming out of time here. Any comments, questions? All right, thank you. Glad you could make it tonight. Where are you heading tomorrow?